I pulled into Jasper just after 2 in the afternoon, my truck loaded with enough gear for 2 weeks in the backcountry. The drive from Denver had taken longer than expected, but I was finally here, ready to tackle a section of the Rocky Mountains I'd been planning to explore for months. First stop was Mountain Peak Outfitters on Connaught Drive. The shop took up a narrow space between a coffee house and a souvenir store, its windows packed with hiking boots and camping equipment. A bell chimed as I pushed through the door, and the smell of treated leather and canvas filled my nose. "Can I help you find something?" The woman behind the counter looked up from organizing a display of headlamps. She was probably in her 30s, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of weathered hands that came from actual outdoor work, not just selling gear. "Just picking up a few last-minute items," I said, grabbing a basket. "Heading out on the Skyline Trail tomorrow." "Oh." Her expression changed, becoming more serious. "You going solo?" "That's the plan." I moved toward the fuel canisters, checking the threading on a few before selecting one. "Been doing solo trips for 20 years. Prefer it that way." She watched me browse for a moment, then stepped out from behind the counter. "I'm Emily, by the way. I've been working here for 6 years, and I know these mountains pretty well." "David." I picked up a package of emergency fire starters, though I doubted I'd need them. "Good to meet you." "Listen, David, I don't usually say this to customers, but you might want to reconsider going alone right now." Emily moved closer, lowering her voice even though we were the only people in the store. "We've had 3 hikers go missing in the past month. All experienced, all well-equipped." I set down the fire starters and looked at her directly. "Missing how?" "They just never came back. Search and rescue found their campsites, gear still there, no signs of struggle, but no people." She wrapped her arms around herself. "One guy's tent was set up perfectly, sleeping bag laid out, but his boots were missing. Who takes off their boots and walks into the wilderness barefoot?" "Could be bears," I said. "Or they fell into a ravine, got turned around, any number of things." "Maybe." Emily didn't look convinced. "But there's something else. The older folks around here, the ones whose families have been in these mountains for generations, they're talking about the Wendigo again." I tried not to smile. "The Wendigo." I know how it sounds, but these stories go back centuries. A creature that stalks the mountains, drives people mad with hunger, makes them do terrible things. She paused, studying my face. "The disappearances always cluster like this. 3 or 4 people in a short time span, then nothing for years." I picked up the fire starters again and added them to my basket. "Emily, I appreciate the concern, but I've been hiking in mountains across North America for 2 decades. I've dealt with grizzlies, mountain lions, severe weather, all of it. I'm not worried about local folklore. It's not just folklore when people are actually missing. You're right about that part. But whatever happened to those hikers, it wasn't a Wendigo." I headed toward the counter. "It was something with a rational explanation. Always is." Emily rang up my purchases without saying anything more. The total came to $43, and I handed her $50 in cash. As she counted out my change, she looked up one more time. "Just be careful out there, okay? And if you start feeling like something's wrong, don't ignore that feeling. Trust your instincts." "I always do." The conversation stayed with me as I drove to the Athabasca Hotel for the night. Emily clearly believed what she was saying, and her concern seemed real. But I'd heard similar warnings before, in the Cascades, in the Appalachians, in the Sierra Nevada. Every mountain range had its stories, its local legends meant to keep outsiders away or just add some mystery to the tourist experience. My room on the 2nd floor had a view of the mountains, and I spent the evening spread out on the bed with my topographic maps, tracing the route I'd planned with a red pen. The Skyline Trail would take me through thick forest for the first day, then up into alpine terrain where the views opened up. I'd budgeted 5 days to reach the northern end, then loop back on a smaller trail that would add another week to the trip. I checked my gear one more time, though I'd already gone through everything twice at home. Tent, sleeping bag, water purification tablets, first aid kit, emergency beacon, flare gun. Food for 14 days plus 2 extra days as backup. I'd done this routine hundreds of times, but the ritual of checking and double-checking always helped me sleep better before a long trip. The morning came early. I was on the road by 6, driving the 20 minutes to the Molina Lake trailhead as the sun crept over the eastern peaks. The parking area was empty except for my truck and a maintenance vehicle. Good. I preferred starting before the day hikers showed up. I put on my pack at 6:30, feeling the familiar weight settle across my shoulders and hips. 65 pounds including water, not light, but reasonable for a 2-week trip. The trail started as a wide gravel path before narrowing into dirt and root systems as it wound into the forest. The first few hours passed quickly. The trail climbed steadily but not steeply, winding through thick stands of spruce and fir. I fell into my hiking rhythm, the one that had carried me through thousands of miles over the years. Step, breathe, step, breathe, focus on the path ahead, and let everything else fade away. By noon, I'd covered 8 miles and stopped for lunch beside a small waterfall. The sound of rushing water drowned out everything else as I ate a granola bar and checked my map. Right on schedule. The trail would level out for the next few miles before climbing again toward the first ridge. I reached my planned campsite just before 5 o'clock, a flat area beside a creek about 30 yards off the main trail. Perfect spot, level ground, running water, and far enough from the path that other hikers wouldn't stumble across my tent. I'd covered 12 miles, exactly what I'd hoped for on the first day. Setting up camp became another familiar ritual. Tent first, staked down properly and rainfly secured. Then the bear cache, strung between 2 trees at regulation height and distance from my sleeping area. Camp stove and cooking gear arranged on a flat rock. Everything organized and accessible. I cooked a simple dinner of pasta with dried vegetables, eating while the sun dropped behind the western peaks. The temperature would fall quickly once full darkness arrived, but for now the evening air felt perfect. This was why I did these trips. The complete silence, the sense of being the only person for miles in any direction, the way all the daily noise and stress just disappeared. Except tonight, the silence felt different somehow. I finished eating and cleaned my dishes in the creek, then sat on a fallen log to plan tomorrow's route. The trail would climb steadily for the first half of the day, then level out as it crossed a high meadow. If the weather held, I'd have clear views of the surrounding peaks. But as I studied the map, I became aware of just how quiet the forest had become. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the brush. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent. Just the steady noise of the creek and the occasional crack of settling wood. I'd experienced quiet forests before, but this felt more complete, more total. I set down the map and listened carefully, trying to identify what might be different. Sometimes a predator moving through an area would cause other animals to go silent, but that usually didn't last long. The quiet stretched on. I told myself it was probably nothing. Weather patterns, time of day, random chance. Forests went through natural cycles of activity and rest. But as I climbed into my tent and settled into my sleeping bag, Emily's warning kept circling back through my thoughts. 3 experienced hikers, missing without explanation, the Wendigo. I'd dismissed it all as folklore this morning, and logically I still did. But lying here in the total silence of the forest, listening for sounds that never came, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something about this place was wrong. Sleep came slowly, and when it finally arrived, Emily's voice followed me into my dreams, asking again why someone would take off their boots and walk barefoot into the wilderness. I woke just after dawn to find the forest still wrapped in that unnatural quiet. My internal clock said it was around 6:30, which meant I'd managed maybe 5 hours of broken sleep. The creek still whispered beside my campsite, but beyond that, nothing. No birds greeting the morning, no squirrels chattering in the trees above my tent. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and pushed through the tent flap, stretching muscles that had never quite relaxed during the night. The air was crisp, probably around 40 degrees, and my breath formed small clouds as I began my morning routine. Coffee first, always coffee first, then breaking down camp and getting back on the trail. 20 minutes later, I was back on the trail. My pack settled into the grooves my shoulders had memorized over thousands of miles. The Skyline Trail continued its steady climb through dense stands of spruce and fir, occasionally opening into small meadows where wildflowers still bloomed in late summer clusters. According to my map, I'd reach treeline by late afternoon. But as the hours passed, that feeling of being watched grew stronger instead of fading. Every few miles, something would make me stop and turn around. Not a sound exactly, more like a sense of movement in my peripheral vision. I'd look around the tree line carefully, searching for the telltale brown figure of a bear or the tawny hide of a mountain lion, but found nothing. Just trees and shadows and the ongoing silence that felt more heavy with each passing hour. Around noon, I stopped for lunch beside a small alpine lake. The water was so clear I could see the bottom 20 feet down, and the surrounding peaks reflected perfectly on the surface. Beautiful country. Exactly what I'd come here to experience. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond my vision, keeping pace with me as I moved deeper into the mountains. I ate quickly and kept moving. The afternoon brought more of the same. Steady climbing, stunning views, and that persistent sense of being stalked. By the time I started looking for a campsite, my nerves were more frayed than they'd been in years. I'd dealt with real dangers before, grizzlies, severe weather, getting lost in whiteout conditions, but this was different. Those threats you could see coming, could prepare for, could respond to with training and experience. This felt like being hunted by something that stayed just out of sight. I found a decent spot to camp about a mile beyond where I'd originally planned to stop, a flat area beside another creek, far enough off the trail that passing hikers wouldn't disturb me. Though given the absolute absence of other people in these mountains, that probably wasn't a concern. Setting up my tent had become second nature, but tonight I found myself checking the surrounding trees more often than usual, looking for movement, listening for sounds that never came. The bear cache went up between two solid pines, my food secured at the required height and distance. Camp stove arranged on the same flat rock I'd used the night before, except this was a different flat rock beside a different creek. But the routine felt the same, and gradually, my nerves began to settle. I cooked another simple dinner and ate while the sun disappeared behind the peaks to the west. The temperature dropped quickly once the light faded, and I retreated into my tent earlier than usual. Not because I was tired, but because being inside the nylon walls somehow felt safer than sitting exposed in the growing darkness. Sleep came easier the second night, maybe because exhaustion finally outweighed anxiety. I'd covered nearly 14 miles of challenging terrain, and my body needed rest whether my mind was ready or not. But something jolted me awake in what felt like the middle of the night. Rustling. Definite rustling close to my tent. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening. There it was again, the sound of something large moving through the bushes just outside my campsite. not the light scrabbling of a raccoon or the quick footsteps of a deer. This was heavier, more deliberate. My hand found the flare gun I'd placed beside my pillow. The rustling continued, circling around toward the front of my tent. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I unzipped the tent entrance as slowly as possible, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness. Cool air rushed in, carrying scents of pine and damp earth. I stuck my head out and called into the darkness, "Hey, get out of here!" The rustling stopped immediately. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam across the area around my tent. Trees, bushes, my bear cache hanging undisturbed between the pines. Nothing moving, nothing out of place, but something had definitely been there. "Go on, get lost!" I shouted again, louder this time. Silence answered me, the kind of complete silence that had been following me since I'd entered these mountains. But now it felt different, watchful instead of empty, like something was listening to me the same way I was listening for it. I kept the flashlight moving, checking every shadow, every gap between the trees. Bears usually made more noise when they investigated campsites, and mountain lions rarely announced their presence like this. Whatever had been circling my tent didn't fit the behavior patterns of any animal I knew. Minutes passed. The cold air began to seep through my thermal shirt, but I didn't want to retreat back into the tent until I was sure the area was clear. I moved the flashlight to my left hand and kept the flare gun ready in my right, finger resting lightly on the trigger. More minutes. Nothing moved. The forest remained locked in that unnatural quiet, but gradually the feeling of being watched began to fade. Whatever had been out there seemed to have moved on. I crawled back into my tent, but left the entrance partially unzipped. If something returned, I wanted to hear it coming. The flare gun stayed beside my pillow, and I kept the flashlight within easy reach. Sleep didn't come again. I lay there listening to every tiny sound, the creak, the occasional crack of settling wood, the whisper of wind through the trees far above. Normal forest sounds, the kind I'd heard thousands of times before. But tonight they felt different, like a mask covering something else. Hours crawled by. I checked my watch repeatedly, willing the hands to move faster toward dawn. 3:15, 3:47, 4:22. The night stretched on forever. Finally, the first hints of gray light began filtering through the tent walls. I'd made it through another night, though I felt more exhausted than when I'd gone to sleep. But at least I could start moving again, put more distance between myself and whatever had been prowling around my campsite. I pushed out of my sleeping bag and crawled toward the tent entrance, planning to start my morning routine early. But when I stuck my head outside, I stopped cold. 20 feet from my tent, directly in the path I would take to reach the creek, lay the body of a massive deer. I stared at it for long seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. The animal was huge, probably a 6-point buck based on the antlers, and it looked fresh. No bloating, no smell of decay, no obvious signs that scavengers had been at it. But the body was positioned so deliberately, so precisely between my tent and the water source, that it couldn't possibly be natural. I grabbed my flashlight and crept out of the tent for a closer look. The deer's throat had been torn open, but not in the ragged way that bears or mountain lions typically killed. The wound was almost surgical in its precision. And the placement, it was like someone had carried the body here and arranged it as a message. But that was impossible. A deer this size would weigh 200 pounds or more. No person could move it quietly enough to avoid waking me, especially not through dense forest in complete darkness. I circled the body slowly, examining it from every angle. No drag marks in the soft earth, no blood trail leading to the spot. The animal seemed to have simply appeared here during the night, positioned with deliberate care just steps from where I slept. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. I'd been dismissive of Emily's warnings about disappearances and local folklore, confident in my years of wilderness experience. But standing here looking at this impossible scene, I couldn't think of any rational explanation. Bears didn't arrange their kills like art installations. Mountain lions didn't deliver messages. And whatever had been circling my tent last night definitely hadn't been trying to scavenge food from my bear cache. I rolled up my sleeping bag and began stuffing gear into my backpack. I needed to get away from this place, put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was stalking me through these mountains. My original plan had called for staying another night in this general area, but that was before I'd found evidence that something was playing games with me. 20 minutes later, I was back on the trail, moving faster than I'd ever moved with a full pack. The deer body lay behind me, positioned exactly where I'd found it, because I hadn't been able to bring myself to touch it or move it aside. Every few hundred yards, I found myself looking back over my shoulder, checking to make sure nothing was following. But the trail behind me remained empty, and gradually, the adrenaline began to fade into a kind of grim determination. I had two options. I could hike back to the trailhead, pack up my truck, and head home to Denver with my tail between my legs. Or I could find a new campsite several miles away and try to convince myself that last night had been some kind of freak occurrence. The smart choice was obvious. Emily had tried to warn me, and maybe I should have listened more carefully to her stories about missing hikers and local legends. But I'd been planning this trip for months, and I wasn't ready to give up after just 2 nights in the mountains. I'd find a better campsite, somewhere more open where I could see anything approaching from a distance. And if the weirdness followed me there, then I'd reconsider my options. 3 miles up the trail, I stopped to check my map and plan a new route. There was a large meadow marked about 5 miles ahead, well above tree line, where I'd have clear sight lines in every direction, perfect for what I had in mind. I folded the map and kept climbing toward higher ground, telling myself that distance and daylight would solve whatever problem was stalking me through the wilderness. But deep down, I was beginning to suspect that some problems couldn't be solved by changing campsites. The meadow I'd chosen sat well above tree line, a flat area of alpine grass surrounded by rocky hills that offered clear views in every direction. No trees meant nothing could approach without me seeing it coming. At least, that was the theory. I dropped my pack near the center of the clearing and looked around the area one more time. The space was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards across, with scattered boulders providing natural windbreaks. Perfect for what I had in mind. Setting up my tent took longer than usual because I kept stopping to look around the surrounding ridges. Nothing moved out there except wind through the grass, but after finding that deer body this morning, I wasn't taking any chances. The memory of that perfectly positioned body still made my skin crawl. Once the tent was secure, I unpacked something I'd never used on a camping trip before, a full spool of 20-pound fishing line. I'd bought it years ago for an actual fishing expedition, but never opened the package. Today, it would serve a different purpose entirely. I spent the next 2 hours rigging an early warning system around my campsite. The fishing line was nearly invisible, especially in low light, and I strung it between rocks and tent stakes about 15 feet out from my sleeping area. Small bells from my first aid kit dangled at regular intervals along the wire. Anyone or anything trying to approach would have to break the line or set off the bells. It felt ridiculous while I was doing it, like something out of a war movie rather than a hiking trip. But as afternoon faded toward evening, I was glad to have something between me and whatever had been stalking me through these mountains. Dinner was another simple affair. Dried soup, heated over my camp stove while I sat on a boulder with clear sight lines to every possible approach route. The soup tasted like cardboard, But eating gave me something to focus on besides the growing shadows and the way the wind through the grass sounded almost like whispers. As darkness approached, I retreated into my tent but left the rain fly partially open so I could hear outside clearly. The flare gun lay beside my pillow again, loaded and ready. My flashlight was clipped to the tent ceiling where I could grab it instantly. The first few hours passed quietly. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every small sound, the ping of cooling metal from my camp stove, the rustle of fabric when I moved position, the distant call of what might have been an owl somewhere far below treeline. Normal sounds, the kind that usually helped me sleep in the wilderness. But tonight, nothing felt normal. Around 11 o'clock, the wind died completely. The meadow fell into the same unnatural silence that had been following me since I'd entered these mountains. But now it felt expectant rather than empty, like the whole landscape was holding its breath. I checked my watch repeatedly, willing the hours to pass faster. Midnight came and went. 12:30. 1 o'clock. The silence stretched on. Then, just after midnight, the sharp crack of snapping wire jolted me fully awake. I grabbed the flare gun and flashlight, my heart hammering as I crawled toward the tent entrance. The sound had come from the north side of my perimeter, maybe 20 feet from where I lay. Something had definitely triggered one of my tripwires. I pushed through the tent flap and stood up slowly, keeping the flare gun ready while I clicked on the flashlight. The beam swept across the meadow grass, searching for whatever had broken my warning system. The fishing line on the north side hung loose between two rocks, severed cleanly about 3 feet above the ground. No torn vegetation, no obvious tracks in the grass. Whatever had triggered it was still out there somewhere. "I know you're there," I called into the darkness, my voice sounding thin and strange in the open air. "Show yourself." Silence answered me, but it was a different quality of silence now, the kind that meant something was listening. I took a step away from my tent, sweeping the flashlight in a wider arc. The beam reached maybe 30 yards before fading into blackness, lighting up patches of grass and scattered rocks, but nothing that moved. Another step. The broken tripwire was directly ahead now, and I could see where something had passed through the line at about chest height for a person, or shoulder height for a very large animal. "Come on," I shouted, louder this time. "What do you want?" That's when I saw them. Two glowing eyes stared back at me from just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. They were wrong somehow. Too large, too high off the ground, reflecting light in a way that made them seem almost electric against the darkness. I raised the flare gun with shaking hands. "Get back. Stay away from me." The eyes didn't move, but something moved in the darkness around them. A massive shape began to emerge from the black, and my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The creature standing 40 feet away went against every rational explanation I'd been holding on to for the past 3 days. It was huge, maybe 7 feet tall, covered in matted fur that looked wet or diseased in the flashlight beam. Its arms and legs were too long, stretched and twisted like something had pulled them on a rack. But the worst part was its face. It looked almost human. The features were wrong, twisted and stretched out, but there was an intelligence in those glowing eyes that no animal should have. It tilted its head as it watched me, the movement deliberate and calculating. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. The thing took a step forward, and I could hear the wet sound its feet made in the grass. Another step. It moved with a jerky walk that showed it wasn't comfortable in its own body, but it covered ground faster than seemed possible. I aimed the flare gun directly at its center and pulled the trigger. The flare streaked across the meadow in a bright arc of red light, lighting up the creature in perfect detail for maybe 2 seconds. Matted black fur hung in patches from long limbs. Its body was massive, but weirdly shaped, like someone had stretched a bear on a medieval torture device. The face was the worst part. Human features warped and twisted until they looked like a child's drawing of a nightmare. The flare struck the thing's center mass and bounced off, leaving a burning spot on its chest that it ignored completely. Instead of backing away, it opened its mouth and let out a sound that made my bones ache. The howl wasn't like anything I'd ever heard from a wolf or coyote. It was deeper, more powerful, with an undertone that seemed to shake through the ground itself. But worse than that, there was something clearly human in the sound, like someone screaming through a throat that had been completely changed. Panic hit me hard. 20 years of wilderness experience, all my training and preparation, reduced to nothing by the sight of something that shouldn't exist. I turned and ran. My backpack was still beside the tent, but I managed to grab it as I sprinted past. The creature was already moving behind me, crashing through the meadow grass with impossible speed. Each footfall sounded like a sledgehammer hitting wet earth. I reached the edge of the clearing and plunged into the rocky terrain beyond, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, lighting up brief glimpses of boulders and scrub brush. Behind me, the crashing sounds grew closer. The creature wasn't just following me, it was hurting me. Every time I tried to angle toward easier terrain, I'd hear it change direction to cut me off. It was driving me deeper into the rocks, away from any possible escape route. My lungs burned from the thin mountain air, and the heavy pack threw off my balance with every step. I stumbled over loose stones, caught myself on sharp granite edges that tore at my hands, kept moving because stopping meant letting that thing catch me. Then, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I dropped into empty space, my stomach lurching as I fell through darkness. The impact came a split second later, a bone-jarring collision with the bottom of what felt like a deep hole. Pain shot through my left leg as it twisted under my body weight, and I heard myself cry out. I lay still for a moment, trying to check the damage. My leg hurt, but didn't feel broken. The backpack had cushioned some of the impact, though I could smell something that might have been fuel leaking from a damaged canister. Above me, maybe 8 feet up, I could see a rough circle of star-filled sky. I'd fallen into some kind of pit, probably an old bear trap or natural sinkhole that had been hidden by plants. That's when I heard the footsteps approach the edge. The creature appeared at the rim of the pit, outlined against the stars. Even from below, its shape looked wrong. Too tall, too angular, like someone had put together a bear from memory and gotten the details backwards. It crouched at the edge and stared down at me with those bright eyes. Then it began to come down, finding handholds in the rocky walls with fingers that were too long and ended in claws that scraped against stone. I scrambled backwards until my shoulders hit the far wall of the pit. There was nowhere else to go. The flare gun had fallen somewhere in the darkness when I hit bottom, and my flashlight had gone out on impact. The creature dropped the last few feet and landed in the pit with me. Up close, the smell was overwhelming. Wet fur and decay and something else, something chemical that burned my nostrils. It stood maybe 6 feet away in the small space, close enough that I could hear its breathing. Each exhale sounded wet and difficult, like there was fluid in its lungs. It took a step toward me, and I pressed harder against the wall behind me. This was it. Whatever this thing was, whatever had happened to those missing hikers Emily had warned me about, I was about to find out firsthand. Then gunfire erupted from somewhere above the pit. The sharp crack of rifle shots bounced off the rocky walls, 3 quick bursts followed by shouting voices. The creature spun toward the sound, its massive head tilting up toward the rim. More shots, Closer this time, and I could hear people moving through the rocks above us. The thing let out another of those bone-deep howls, but this one sounded different, frustrated rather than triumphant. It looked back at me once, those electric eyes burning in the darkness, then turned and scrambled up the pit wall with smooth grace. I heard it reach the top, heard more gunfire and voices shouting commands I couldn't quite make out. Then heavy footsteps moving away at high speed, followed by the sound of pursuit. I lay alone at the bottom of the pit, my injured leg hurting and my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Someone else was out here in the wilderness. Someone with guns who had been tracking the same creature that had been stalking me. But who? And how had they found me in time? Above me, the voices grew more distant as whatever was happening moved away through the rocks. I tried to stand and immediately regretted it. My left leg couldn't support any weight, and touching it sent waves of pain up my spine. I was trapped down here, injured and alone again, with no idea whether that thing would come back or whether my mysterious rescuers would return to help me. All I could do was wait in the darkness and hope that someone would remember where I'd fallen. I sat at the bottom of the pit for what felt like hours, though my watch said only 20 minutes had passed since the gunshots faded into the distance. My left leg had settled into a steady throb that worsened whenever I tried to change position. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and every small sound, rocks settling, wind through the scrub above, made me tense. Then I heard voices approaching, closer than before. "Down here," someone called from above. A bright LED beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the pit walls and making me squint. "We've got him." 3 figures appeared at the rim, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. One of them was tying a rope around a boulder while the others checked their gear. Professional movements, practiced efficiency that reminded me of military operations I'd seen in documentaries. David Miller? The voice belonged to a man in his 30s with short dark hair and tactical clothing. He was already clipping into the rope system. "I'm Aiden Torres. We're going to get you out of there." I watched him rappel down the pit wall with practiced ease, landing softly a few feet away from where I sat. Up close, he looked exactly like what Emily might call a government type. Square jaw, intense brown eyes, the kind of muscular build that came from regular training rather than recreational fitness. "Are you injured?" He knelt beside me and clicked on a small flashlight, checking me over with quick, professional movements. "My left leg," I managed. "Twisted it when I fell. I don't think it's broken, but I can't put weight on it." Aiden called up to his team. "We need the medical kit and a harness. Possible sprain or fracture on the left leg." He turned back to me. "We're going to get you stable and then haul you up. This might hurt." One of his team members lowered a canvas bag on a separate line. Aiden opened it and pulled out supplies that looked far more advanced than the basic first aid kit in my backpack. Instant cold packs, elastic bandages, what looked like prescription pain medication. "Who are you people?" I asked as he wrapped my leg with practiced efficiency. "How did you find me?" "We've been tracking the same animal that attacked you," he said without looking up from his work. "Been following it for 3 weeks now. We heard the commotion and saw your flare." The pain medication kicked in faster than I expected, dulling the sharp edges of the throbbing in my leg. Aiden fitted a climbing harness around my waist and legs, adjusting the straps to avoid putting pressure on my injury. "What was that thing?" The question came out quieter than I intended, but Aiden heard it. "We'll talk about that once we get you topside." The trip up felt endless. Aiden climbed beside me, helping my movements and making sure I didn't bang my injured leg against the rocky walls. His team pulled steadily from above, and within minutes I was lying on solid ground beside the pit, breathing hard from the effort and medication. The other 3 men stood nearby, all dressed in similar tactical gear and carrying military-style rifles. They looked like they belonged to some kind of specialized unit, the type that didn't officially exist in government paperwork. Aiden helped me sit up with my back against a boulder. Before we go any further, I need to know what you saw down there. I described the creature as accurately as I could. The size, the matted fur, the wrong proportions, those bright eyes that seemed almost electric in the darkness. Aiden listened without interrupting, occasionally looking at his team members. "The face," I said finally. It looked almost human, not like any bear I've ever seen. Aiden was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "What you encountered wasn't a Wendigo or any kind of supernatural entity. It was a black bear, probably a mature male around 400 pounds. But it was infected with something we don't fully understand yet." "Infected with what?" "A parasite. We're still studying it, but the effects are..." He gestured vaguely toward the pit where I'd been trapped. "You saw the results. Extreme physical mutations, altered brain chemistry, aggressive behavior that goes way beyond normal predator patterns." I stared at him. "You're telling me that thing was just a sick bear?" "Not just sick. The parasite causes massive physiological changes. Elongated limbs, altered facial structure, enhanced night vision. The infected animals are stronger, faster, and far more aggressive than normal. They also seem to retain enough intelligence to use tactics. That explained the deer carcass positioned outside my tent, the way the creature had herded me toward the pit. Not supernatural intelligence, but enhanced animal cunning driven by infection." "How many animals are affected?" "We've confirmed at least 6 in this region. Bears, mountain lions, possibly wolves. The parasite appears to spread through direct contact, though we're still mapping the transmission vectors." Aiden's team was already packing up their gear, moving with the same professional efficiency they'd shown during the rescue. One of them approached and handed Aiden a tablet computer. "Mr. Miller, I need you to understand something. This operation is classified. The research, the infected animals, everything you've seen and heard tonight. None of it can be discussed with anyone." He turned the tablet toward me. "This is a non-disclosure agreement. It's not optional." I read through the document on the screen. Standard government language about national security, criminal penalties for disclosure, lifetime binding terms. The kind of paperwork that made people disappear if they talked too much. "What happens to the infected animals?" "We're working on containment protocols. Right now, our priority is keeping people away from affected areas until we can develop effective countermeasures." "You mean killing them?" Aiden's expression didn't change. "Regular weapons don't work well. The changes make them really hard to kill, and herd infected animals become even more dangerous. We're looking into other options." I signed the NDA with a finger stylus, not because I wanted to, but because saying no didn't seem realistic. These men had saved my life, but they also had the kind of authority that didn't take no for an answer. The walk back to my campsite took an hour, with me leaning heavily on Aiden for support. My tent and gear were exactly where I'd left them, untouched by whatever had happened in the meadow. The fishing line perimeter I'd set up was destroyed, cut and torn in multiple places. "The creature came back after you ran," Aiden explained as I packed my equipment. "It searched the area thoroughly before we drove it off." "Looking for what?" "You. These infected animals don't give up easily once they've identified a target." That thought stayed with me during the long walk back to the trailhead. Aiden's team moved in formation around us, constantly looking around the tree line with night vision equipment. Whatever they were hunting was still out there, and I got the impression this wasn't their first encounter with it. My truck was parked exactly where I'd left it 3 days ago, covered in a thin layer of morning dew. The normal world felt strange after everything that had happened. Keys, ignition, radio stations, the familiar buzz of the engine, like stepping back into civilization from some prehistoric nightmare. "Avoid this area indefinitely," Aiden said as I settled into the driver's seat. "The infection appears to be spreading, and we don't know how far it will reach." "What about other hikers? Other people who might come out here?" "We're working on area closures and wildlife advisories. For now, the best thing you can do is forget this ever happened." I drove away from the trailhead as dawn broke over the eastern peaks, watching Aiden and his team disappear into the forest in my rearview mirror. The drive back to Jasper took forever, my injured leg making it difficult to work the pedals properly. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the questions going through my mind. A parasite that could transform a black bear into something that looked like a movie monster. Government teams tracking infected animals through classified operations. Non-disclosure agreements that carried criminal penalties. The logical explanations I'd been looking for turned out to be more disturbing than any folklore. I checked into the Athabasca Hotel again, the same room I'd stayed in before the trip. The desk clerk recognized me and asked how the hiking went. I told him it was shorter than planned due to an ankle injury. Not technically a lie, and easier than trying to explain the truth. The next morning, I caught a flight back to Denver, spending most of the trip staring out the window at the Rocky Mountains, stretching endlessly below. Somewhere down there, infected animals were hunting through forests that looked peaceful and pristine from 30,000 feet. Sleep didn't come easily that first night back home. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those electric yellow eyes staring at me from the darkness. The creature's face, almost human but completely wrong, twisted by whatever was growing inside its brain. Behind it all, Aiden's words about the infection spreading, reaching areas they couldn't predict or control. The nightmares followed me through the week. Glowing eyes chasing me through endless dark forests, distorted faces coming out of shadows, the wet sound of claws scraping against stone. I'd wake up sweating, checking the locks on my doors and windows, wondering if something could track me even here. During the day, I told myself it was over. I'd survived, I was home, and whatever was happening in those mountains was someone else's problem now. But at night, when my logical defenses were down, I kept thinking about that almost human intelligence in the creature's eyes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that signing that non-disclosure agreement had been the worst decision of my life. I kept telling myself that getting back into my old routine would fix everything. 3 weeks after signing that NDA and flying home from Jasper, I was still trying to convince myself that life could go back to normal. It couldn't. The first thing I noticed was how different my own house felt. I'd lived in the same 2-story colonial in South Denver for 8 years, but walking through those rooms felt like visiting a place I'd only seen in photographs. Everything looked right. My furniture, my books, the hiking photos covering the walls, but nothing felt right. I started checking the door locks every night before bed. Then I added the windows to my routine. Within a week, I was testing every entry point twice, sometimes 3 times, before I could even think about sleep. The rational part of my brain knew it was too much, but the rest of me remembered those glowing eyes and the wet sound of claws on stone. My weekend hiking group called twice asking when I'd be ready for the next trip. I made excuses both times. The thought of walking into any kind of wilderness, even the trails around Boulder or Golden, made my stomach clench. 20 years of backcountry experience, and now I couldn't handle the idea of being more than a few miles from pavement. Work became my escape. I threw myself into software development projects with an intensity that surprised my colleagues. Code was logical, predictable, safe. Unlike whatever was happening in the mountains, programming problems had clear solutions and measurable outcomes. I stayed late most nights, partly because the office felt safer than going home, and partly because exhaustion helped me sleep. But it was Max who really made me understand that something had changed. My golden retriever had always been the perfect hiking companion. 8 years old, well-trained, completely comfortable in the outdoors. He'd spent hundreds of hours on mountain trails with me, sleeping peacefully in my tent, while coyotes called in the distance. Now Max spent his days sitting by the back door. It started about a week after I returned from Colorado. I'd come home from work to find him planted in front of the sliding glass door that led to my small backyard, just staring out at the cluster of oak and pine trees that bordered my property. When I called his name, he'd turn briefly, then go right back to watching. At first, I figured he was tracking squirrels or maybe a raccoon that had been raiding garbage cans in the neighborhood. Dogs did that sometimes, especially when they picked up interesting scents. But this was different. Max wasn't showing typical prey interest. No tail wagging, no excited whining, no attempts to paw at the door to get outside. He just sat there with a focus that felt almost human. The behavior got worse as the days passed. Max would position himself at the back door right after breakfast and stay there for hours, only moving when I physically led him away for food or bathroom breaks. Even then, he'd return to his post within minutes. The real change came after dark. Max had always loved evening walks through the neighborhood, padding alongside me on the sidewalks while I checked mail or talked to neighbors. Now he refused to go outside once the sun went down. The first time I tried to take him out for his usual nighttime routine, he planted his feet at the entrance and wouldn't budge. I had to practically drag him onto the back patio, and he trembled the entire time. Then, there was the whimpering. It happened whenever I approached the rear windows of the house, especially the kitchen window that offered the clearest view of the wooded area. Max would appear beside me and let out these low, nervous sounds that I'd never heard from him before. Not quite whines, not quite growls, but something in between that made the hair on my arms stand up. I tried to rationalize it. Dogs were sensitive to changes in their owner's behavior, and I'd definitely been acting differently since returning from the mountains. Maybe Max was picking up on my worry and reflecting it back. Maybe the trauma of my experience had somehow transferred to him through pheromones or subtle behavioral cues I wasn't aware of. But deep down, I suspected something else was going on. The evening that changed everything happened on a Thursday, in mid-October. I'd gotten home from work around 7, fed Max's dinner, and settled into my usual routine of checking email while he took up his position by the back door. The sun had set an hour earlier, and the motion sensor light on my neighbor's garage provided the only light in the backyard. Max was more agitated than usual. Instead of his typical silent vigil, he kept moving position and making those worried sounds deep in his throat. His ears were forward, fully alert, and his whole body was tense like he was ready to either fight or run. I walked over to see what had captured his attention. The wooded area behind my house wasn't large, maybe 30 feet deep before it opened onto the next street. Oak trees mostly, with a few pines scattered throughout and enough plants to block a clear view through to the other side. During the day, I could see kids cutting through on bikes or neighbors walking their dogs along the informal paths that crisscrossed the space. Tonight, something was moving back there. It wasn't the typical rustling of small animals or wind through leaves. The movement was too deliberate, too controlled. Something large was making its way through the trees parallel to my back fence, staying just beyond where the neighboring motion lights could reach it. I grabbed my binoculars from the hall closet and returned to the kitchen window. Max positioned himself right beside me, still making those worried sounds, but no longer trying to warn me away from the glass. Through the binoculars, the trees looked closer, but not clearer. The darkness between the trunks was complete, and the few patches of light from surrounding houses created more shadows than visibility. I checked the area systematically, looking at every gap and open space I could identify. Nothing. Whatever I'd seen moving was either gone or staying perfectly still. But Max hadn't relaxed. If anything, he seemed more focused now, his attention fixed on a specific cluster of pine trees about 20 feet from the fence line. His whole body was rigid with tension, and the whimpering had stopped completely. I kept the binoculars trained on that spot for another 10 minutes, but my eyes were starting to water from the strain. Finally, I gave up and closed the blinds. Max continued his vigil until I physically led him to his bed around midnight. The next morning, I walked the tree line along my back fence, looking for signs of whatever had been out there. Broken branches, footprints, disturbed plants, anything that might explain what Max and I had sensed the night before. I found nothing obvious. The ground was covered in fallen leaves that could have concealed tracks, and the recent dry weather meant the soil was too hard to show clear impressions. But near the cluster of pines that had drawn Max's attention, I noticed several low branches that looked freshly broken, snapped off about 6 feet from the ground. Could have been kids, could have been a large dog running loose, could have been anything. But standing there in the morning sunlight, looking up at those broken branches, I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes in the mountain darkness, or the way that creature had moved through the rocks with fluid grace, navigating terrain that should have slowed it down. That afternoon, I tried calling Aiden Torres. I'd kept his contact information in my phone, though I wasn't sure if reaching out violated the NDA I'd signed. The document had been specific about not discussing the incident or the information I'd learned, but it hadn't explicitly forbidden contact with the team members who'd rescued me. The call went straight to an automated voicemail system that didn't identify the organization or provide any real information. I left a brief message explaining that I'd noticed some unusual animal activity near my home and wanted to report it as requested. I gave my location and contact information, then waited for a callback that never came. I tried again 3 days later with the same result, and again the following week. Either Aiden's number was no longer in service, or calls from civilians weren't considered high priority for whatever organization he worked for. The non-disclosure agreement made seeking help anywhere else impossible. How could I explain to local animal control or police that I was worried about infected wildlife without mentioning the classified operation I'd witnessed? How could I describe my concerns without sounding like someone who'd watched too many horror movies? I was completely on my own. That realization hit me harder than I'd expected. For 3 weeks, I'd been telling myself that my experience in the mountains was an isolated incident, something contained and managed by professionals who knew what they were doing. But if I couldn't even reach those professionals when I needed to report a potential problem, what did that say about their containment efforts? Max's behavior was getting worse. He'd stopped eating regularly and had developed a nervous habit of pacing between the back door and the front windows, like he was trying to monitor all possible approaches to the house. His sleep was restless, and twice I'd woken up to find him standing guard in my bedroom doorway, alert and watching the stairs. I started keeping the flare gun in my nightstand drawer. It was the same emergency flare I'd carried in the mountains, still loaded and ready to fire. Having it within reach helped me sleep, though I wasn't sure what good a single flare would do against something that had shrugged off a direct hit in the wilderness. By early November, I'd installed motion sensor lights around the entire perimeter of my property. The hardware store clerk who sold me the equipment made jokes about paranoid homeowners and urban crime rates, but I just smiled and bought extra batteries. The lights weren't perfect protection, but they'd give me warning if anything large approached the house after dark. Winter was coming. The leaves had fallen from most of the trees, opening up sight lines that had been blocked all summer. Snow would make tracking easier, revealing footprints and movement patterns that were invisible on dry ground. Part of me hoped the changing season would drive away whatever was lurking in the woods behind my house, But another part of me, the part that remembered Aiden's warnings about the infection spreading, suspected that winter wouldn't solve anything. The parasite that had changed those mountain animals didn't seem limited by normal biological constraints. If it could elongate limbs and mess with brain chemistry, why couldn't it adapt to different climates and environments? If infected animals could track prey across miles of difficult terrain, what would stop them from following scent trails down from the mountains and into populated areas? Max's behavior suggested that something had already made that journey. Sitting in my kitchen on a cold November evening, watching my dog maintain his nervous vigil at the back door, I finally understood what Aiden's team had really been fighting in those mountains. Not just a few infected animals in a remote wilderness area, but the leading edge of something much larger. Something that could spread beyond any containment efforts, reaching places and people that were supposed to be safe. My encounter in the wilderness wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning of a threat that could reach anyone, anywhere.